I am 17.
22.
18.
I'm 15 and I live in Dallas, Texas.
I think people in my generation are less tolerant to blatant racism.
Kids nowadays tend to grow up thinking that the problem's in the past.
In America now, being a white Christian is the hardest thing.
I didn't do anything to you guys, so step off.
I don't see color.
It feels bad to know that I am better off because I was born this way.
I would be in jail if I wasn't white.
I just hate that like everything is made into a racist something.
Like immigration. I think that has a lot to do with race too.
I'm not saying I'm not Hispanic or Mexican. I'm just not saying that I am.
If I said I'm black, people would believe me. If I said I'm Hispanic, people would believe me. If I said I'm white, nobody would believe me.
I don't really care what you see when you look at me. That says nothing about who I am.
Thanks, everybody. Whitney, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start right from the top. How did this start? How did the Whiteness Project start for you, outside of being born white?
I was going to say being white. No, I've been making films about race for a number of years, and I kind of got concerned that all the films that I've been making, I have a black producing partner, focused on people of color, that I wasn't making films about people like me. And I had this experience. I was being interviewed by this young girl on for a program, and she asked me what I learned about my racial identity working with my partner Marco. And I had this sort of epiphany where I didn't have a racial identity. And I, of course, have the most powerful racial identity in America. I'm a white male. And so I decided I really wanted to go out and make a project that looked at how white people like me experience their race.
But as a person who was primarily focused on projects or films about race, you didn't feel like you had a racial identity just in terms of how you viewed yourself in regards to these documentaries or in regards to these subjects? You never sort of analyzed your own self while you sort of documented these other perspectives?
Weird, right?
Are you serious? Really?
No, I guess what I would say is not that I didn't think I had a racial identity, but I hadn't really investigated how my race impacted every moment of my everyday. And once I started to really think about how my race was impacting my life, it was like getting X-ray glasses. Suddenly I sort of saw like the Matrix, how all my relationships, like I think that most white people don't think of their race as this like active, dynamic component, and I would argue that is the thing that impacts your experience in the world the most profoundly. And once you start to see that, it's kind of, you see how every situation you go in, whether it's a meeting or a social situation or things with your family, is filled with race. I think that most of the times white people think that the only time they're having a racial experience is when they're talking to people of color, as opposed to when I'm talking to you, I'm having as much of a racialized experience as I have when I'm talking to someone who's not white.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you talk about kind of almost like it's the Matrix, where you've taken the pill and you can kind of see how everything is now, or like the Carpenter movie Them, where they put the sunglasses on and they can see where everything is now. There is, like in the Carpenter movie, I think there is a fear that people have of putting those sunglasses on and seeing the way that their racial identity makes up who they are and makes up how everything is. People, it's like suddenly their world is completely shattered and different, and they have to look at themselves in a different way, or at least check themselves a little bit. And a lot of people are very scared to do that. Did you find that was the case while you were shooting a lot of these interviews?
Well, I think not so much for the interviews. I think that what's interesting about the interviews is that most people, I could make a whole film of people saying, I've never thought about that before. Because I think that most white people don't interrogate race or their own race. And so, but I think for me, I think there is a lot of fear for white people to engage this. I think this idea that an acceptance or an admission of something that is, the idea that there is white privilege or there is structural racism or there is like a structure of white supremacy, is an admission of some kind of guilt. And I think that there is this fear that by admitting it, you're losing something, that you necessarily have to give up something.
Yeah.
And I would say that,
does that mean that I can't live the life that I've lived all of this time because I am recognizing that I know that there is structural racism? I think a lot of people have that fear.
Well, I think that it does mean you can't live life. I think that once you see it, you live your life differently. But I would also say that you get that it enhances, what I've gotten back has been so much greater. All my interactions with people, all my business relationships have been fundamentally enhanced in this incredible way. And I find it kind of like a weird evangelist to this. And but it's true. But that's not to say that there isn't loss. I also now see the culture that I come from very differently than I saw it before. And there's no question there is some loss there. But I don't think this idea that you have to be guilty, like the idea that by admitting that there's this structural racism or there is white privilege, you have to accept guilt for it. I think you can't be guilty of the way you're born. You have to be guilty for the way you live your life.
A lot of times it's not about accepting guilt, it's about being open to the conversation, right? There's a lot, I don't want to say there's a lot of white people. It's like a very general
Well, there's
thing
two
to
of them
say.
right here.
Yeah, but white people, you know? No, there is a thing, though, when it comes to sort of being in a position of power and sort of being born into a position of power, be it as a rich person or as just a white person, you know, where you sort of don't want to accept that you know that you are in this position, that something was handed to you. We live in a culture where it's pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You worked for it, you earned it, even though you may not have. You may have been sort of born into a lucky atmosphere.
Right, and that's where the data comes in the project, is that the data is incontrovertible, right? I mean, that like being white and being a white male is better than being anything else. Objectively better in the fact that you live longer, your mortgage rate is lower, you have better health care, you have better opportunities, jobs, you have more opportunity for education. Then that's why you know, the interviews that I do, when you see them, they're personal stories. You see some very personal stories in here. But I always like to frame it in this idea that those personal stories are representational of something that's broader. It's not just an individual experience. And I think that's a lot of times because white people tend to see themselves as individuals. We always want to be taken as an individual. We don't want to think of ourselves as part of a group, and that this idea that your individual experience really is reflected in this broader societal construct.
It leads to a lot of sort of anecdotal evidence as to why, you know, you're not racist or racism doesn't exist, because you're so individualized or think of yourself as such an individual that just your experience or your perception of your experience is what you think makes up the fabric of all around you sometimes.
Absolutely, that idea, yes. And I think that it's sort of two things. One is that this idea that, yeah, your individual experience is representative of what? Your individual experience, right? But there's also this idea that you're going to necessarily be taken as an individual. And what I learned in this project, doing other projects on race, is this idea that just because you're just because you have the right motivations, is kind of like good intentions are a guarantee of nothing, right? Like that you can't help how you're going to be perceived. You can't help. And I had an experience at one point when I was making this film about when I was making a film with in Texas in a part of town where a horrible murder had occurred, and I was interviewing this group of black men who owned this auto body store, and my partner, who's black, went back and talked to them later on and filmed them again. It was revealed to me that they had changed their names with me. They had made up all these stories for me because they didn't trust me. And this idea that my good intentions of telling their story, they still saw me as a threat. And for me, that was sort of a really sort of like shocking moment to recognize that I could be perceived as threatening despite what I thought was my incredibly good intentions.
So how did you set about finding the subjects for the interviews for the Whiteness Project? What was the sort of initial hypothesis in terms of the subjects that you were pulling?
It was actually interesting that you asked that, because this actually is the fourth city I've done. I've done New York, Milwaukee, Buffalo, and now Dallas. And the first two cities, I had to come to terms with the fact that the traditional production process was just providing a lot of middle-class white people, and I needed to broaden the scope of people. So I worked very hard to get as broad a group of people as possible. And so I find them a lot of different ways. I do it through local producers, through schools, through Craigslist, of course, through Yik Yak, and then I have a really...
Yik Yak?
Yik Yak.
Is that a made-up thing that you just said for fun?
Do you know what Yik Yak is? Do you know what Yik Yak is?
I do not know what Yik Yak is. Okay, no, now I get it's a real thing. I believe you now.
Yeah, no, Yik Yak is, it's essentially, it's like an anonymous...
You were like, yada, yada, yada. Like...
No. It's amazing. It's like an anonymous geolocation Twitter, so that you can, like, it's essentially, you just hit people in a certain, it's anonymous, but it's with a certain, like, radius. We say we're interviewing people I did everything out of the PBS stations. If you're interested in coming back and talk about race and you're white, come down, and people would wander in.
Now, you said you did New York, right?
Yes.
Now, did you find that there was a difference of opinion or just sort of belief structures when you're talking about New York versus Buffalo, New York? Buffalo being a sort of traditional blue-collar working class city, New York being slightly more upper middle class, upper class, that the sort of the education levels or opinions were different?
Well, absolutely, but I think more than anything, it was the first city I did, and that was like the most glaringly obvious that I was just bringing people like myself, and that was when I saw it was really problematic, and that I really needed to expand how I did the recruitment of people. But I think Buffalo, the reason why I did Buffalo is I wanted to do a northern city, because I think when people talk about race, they often are like, oh, that's a southern problem. Let's do it in the South, and it's also a city that
Boston.
I grew up in Boston. Are you from Boston?
I'm from Massachusetts.
Yeah, so you know, it's like living in the Balkans if you live in Boston. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty rugged up there. So, but that Buffalo had a very traditional racial divide. It had a street, of course, called Main Street, which divides the black side of the city from the white side of the city. And so it also was a good stand-in for a lot of cities like Cleveland or Pittsburgh or other Rust Belt cities, Cincinnati. Where I went to Dallas, I wanted to go to a place that had a more modern, complex racial, it had additional black-white division, but also had a rapidly growing Latino population, Asian population, because I was actually in the second one looking more not at monolithic whiteness, but how whiteness fit into equations of identity. So you saw in this, there were people who were biracial, multiracial, Latino, transgender, that whiteness, people often talk about identity, but they also leave the idea of whiteness out of the equation.
Now, when you have an interview subject, a white person that says, I don't see color, right? Do you view that as part of the problem?
Not part of the problem. I think it's like, almost like saying, I don't know how to talk about this. Because if you watch those interviews, they say, I don't see color, I see everybody as an individual. And then the next sentence, they talk about some incredibly dramatic moment of their life that their color impacted. So of course they see color. But I think it's this sense that, look, I have young children. The lines they'll say, oh, I was a so-and-so, I don't want to be racist, but she's black. And describing her, this idea that somehow by acknowledging race, you're somehow being racist. And I think that, especially in this generation, because this idea that everybody should be free to choose their own identity, that you ever want to make anything could be taken as pejorative when it comes to race.
Or it's also a sort of misinformation about political correctness, that political correctness means just bringing up someone's race or not sort of bringing up it in a way that, like, maybe the tone is incorrect or just the wording is incorrect, but in actuality, like, not seeing color is negating someone else's experience, someone else's culture in many ways. You shouldn't sort of restrict yourself from being able to see where someone is coming from culturally.
Right, I think that the line is like, if you don't see color, you're not seeing me, right? And I think that that's exactly right, that the idea that you wouldn't see color. And I think that we're really in this extraordinary time right now where, things are changing, right? There's forces, whiteness is being recentered all around the world, whether it's by cultural forces, internal cultural forces like our country or other countries that were originally colonies, or by countries that were sort of traditionally white, like Scandinavia, where they're being changed by the forces of immigration. And white people have to grapple with it. I think we talked a little bit before the show earlier about this idea that white people like to talk about inclusion when really things are it's not about including you into an existing structure. The demographic changes happening in this culture right now are transforming it. And I think that's one of the things you're seeing in the political race is people's response to that is not knowing what that means for them. And it's a great unknowing, and it creates a lot of anxiety.
Now, you talked about the racial divide of cities across this country, and I think it's something that a lot of people, maybe some people don't know, which is that there is a very clear divide in a lot of cities of where the white people live and where the black people live. The more cities you go to, do you keep seeing that?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, so the next phase of the project, I'm going to be doing a nationwide tour where I'm going to be doing 20 more cities. And, I think that, we get... One of the reasons why, we are all, I'm guessing a lot of people in the audience are from New York. It's kind of, we have this, even New York, you think of New York as being this multicultural, mixed up city, but there are neighborhoods that are very, very divided. And I think in any city you go into, you're going to see that.
Well, there's a big project I think that Dig did a few weeks ago about East New York, which is a part of New York that isn't talked about at all, and it's a predominantly minority neighborhood, and it's very working class, if not very poor. You're a filmmaker, and obviously when it comes to movies, when it comes to films and storytelling, the majority of people's stories are from Hollywood or they're from the mainstream. And when it comes to race, the stories that we're normally told are stories of, are triumphant stories, you know, where slavery is over, or someone was able to conquer something. We're rarely told the stories of what is actually existing right now and happening right now. And do you find that a lot of times the culture itself whitewashes or tries to sort of hide from what's happening right now by trying to tell triumphant stories of the past?
You know, you're kind of singing you're like talking about one of my hobby horses now. I look at films.
Singing your song?
Yeah, you're singing my song. I look at like 12 Years a Slave, and I was like, that, to me, that's a film that could have been made by a white person, just showing, oh, they picked the worst white person to show, focus on them, and all the modern ways. So thank God that that's all in the past. That's not us. That doesn't really relate to us. Or the Nate Turner story is the next thing coming down the pike. And there's rarely stories that really look at race at the way it is now. I think that it's you know it's cliche to say that it's either the original sin or it's the fault line that runs through all of our our institutions, our cultural institutions, our political institutions. But it's a reality, and I think because it is so fraught, people are really afraid to tackle it head on. I thought like Fruitvale Station did an interesting job of it, a couple of years ago, Ryan Coogler. But I think it's a very, very complicated subject.
I mean, to think that we've moved past any kind of racism in this country is almost completely absurd when you're talking about North Carolina, right? Just taking down the Confederate flag, that is a symbol of racism that is now, over to 150 years old, something like that. Sorry, I can't remember when the Civil War was, 1860 something, 1870.
Yes.
Yeah. And to be like, well, we're over racism, and then for people to say, well, that's just a symbol of where they're from. Like, we so often try to negate everything that something represents so we don't have to talk about race, but can maintain racist structures.
Well, I think Americans have a really conflicted relationship with the past. And I think, we love talk about effect, but we hate to talk about cause. And I think that, we as Americans, we like to look to the future. And we also, I think, have this story of ourselves as this force for good in the world, and yet so much of our history is in direct opposition to that. And I think that is tough, because I think that even you both can be someone who's interested in social justice, someone who is basically their birthright is injustice, and also be looking to the future for social justice. So I think it is absolutely, it's very, very, very complicated.
In doing something like the Whiteness Project, I have to ask, how do you view the rise of Donald Trump and his ideologies? And even, I hate to just use Donald Trump, Ted Cruz as well, the ideologies of Ted Cruz and Donald Trump. Where do you see that sort of stemming from and coming from?
Well, I think it's what I said earlier, this idea of things are changing. There's no question they're changing. And there's no question that that there's incredible anxiety around that change. But I also think that that's not to say that there aren't certain, people who are in the white community that are hurting financially, or their world is shifting. I'm sure you read that report a few months ago about the highest rate that the age of death is declining among middle-aged white men. That it's actually that they're dying younger instead of not growing older. And so I think that there is this incredible, but it's also I think also it's also an example of, I think, this idea you talked earlier about white people wanting to be taking individuals, and they think that their individual experience is representational of something broader. And just because you are hurting, and I would not take anybody's individual story or individual experience away from them, but that's not an indicator of what the actual structure is, your individual story. So I think the people that are hurting, and I think that also what white people like to do or tend to do is that they only want to put what's negative on the scale. That they say, okay, I didn't get that. You might actually not have gotten that job because of affirmative action. You might not have gotten something, but again, what I talked about before. What about your mortgage rate might be lower? You might live longer. You might have. When you look at and say the average, I think what the average net worth of a Black American family is $11,000, and the average net worth of a white American family, I think, is $148,000, something like that. Your experience might be bad, but what we're talking about as society is the broader structure and the broader problem.
I feel like you're asking Americans to try to put things into context, and that's crazy. They are not known for contextualizing history or current events at all. You might be at a loss on that one. I want to turn it over to the audience for questions.
Hi, Whitney.
Hi.
So in the clip that we watched, the people that were interviewed, it seemed like a good mix of male and female. When you got the responses, did you see that the males had a similar view topic of white people versus female, or was it the themes were generally combined?
I think actually I try really hard to have a balance of male and female always in what I do, and I try and cover both gender, sexuality, different things. But no, I actually think if you watch all the clips, and if you go to the whitenessproject.org, www.whitenessproject.org, you will see that there are people from both male and female who talk about some of the same things, whether it's being understanding and accepting to the idea of white privilege, and also really in denial about it. So I didn't really see a big split in between male and female. What I did think is interesting, though, is I talked to a lot of women, and more older than this was focusing on people who are millennials, 15 to 25. I think the oldest one is 27. Is that I talk to a lot of women, and they say, you know, the discrimination. I don't get the benefit of white privilege because I'm so discriminated against because of a woman. My experience of a woman kind of negates that. From the same way, I had a really interesting conversation with a gay man who said, you know, I'm a gay white male. Everybody sees me as gay. I'm so effeminate that I don't get the benefit of that white privilege. Where my boyfriend, he's a white gay male. He passes all the time, so he gets treated very, very differently than me. He gets treated as a white male, which is fundamentally being different than being treated as a gay white male.
Next question.
Hey, Whitney. So I'm curious, what is your screening process exactly when putting together a cut of the, I guess, the final project of what you're working on? Just going by the little clip, it seems to me that some of the things that were said could lead to some people maybe, you know, it just reads as insensitive. And as a filmmaker, I think there's a lot of responsibility there. So how do you decide what's aired and what's not?
I'm glad you asked that question, because what you saw is a trailer, not the finished product. And so I'm, you know, obviously I want to get people to look at it, and so I pull out some of the more, not provocative, but I would think interesting things. I take my responsibility to the people I put in the project incredibly seriously. And the way I do the process is that I tell everybody not to sign the release when they sit down to interview with me until we finish the interview. If there's anything they don't like about the experience, anything they don't like about me, anything uncomfortable that they've said, I tell them don't sign the release. I won't use anything.
Have you ever regretted that?
No. I've actually had people sign a release and someone call me later and say, look, I really feel uncomfortable, please don't use it. And I've taken it out. I take very seriously the responsibility, not about whether they like how they're represented or not, but that it's representational of the experience I had with them. That I don't take things out of context. I want to have them represented accurately. And that's really what I feel is, now look, I'm not a, you know, that's my role as a filmmaker. I don't feel my role is to necessarily protect people. That's not my job. My job is to represent them accurately and not not take something out of context. And I also don't use people that I feel would, you know, it would be unfair in my mind. If I think, like, I don't think that they're necessarily cognizant of what they're doing, I don't use that. So for those 23 interviews that are in this iteration, I interviewed 39 people, and I didn't use a lot of them because I didn't think that what it would either be fair, or I didn't think that I could pull something out that actually was representative of the experience I had with them.
Have you ever had someone who was okay with the release but said something that in your opinion was just too inflammatory, that it was just going to outweigh the project or weigh it too far into, sort of weigh the scale in too far in one way?
No, because, I mean, you know, and I think if you're a filmmaker, you probably understand this. People who come into the studio and sit in front of me want to be there. They essentially have something in my mind. And everybody asks me, what are the questions you ask them? And I do have a set of questions, but really I consider my job is to get an understanding of why they're there to talk to me. And it usually means that I go down some sort of road with them until I find this place why they're there. And so people say, how did you get that person to talk to you? How did you get the person to talk to you? Well, they're not admitting something secret to me. They're there because they have something on their mind. And I feel like, you have a platform. You have this thing. I have a platform. Most people in the world don't have a platform to be heard, and a lot of people feel like the media doesn't represent accurately their viewpoint. And so I kind of look as this is an opportunity to talk about something that a lot of people care a lot about, to give them a platform to have themselves heard.
What's your question that gets them, not your starter question, because I'd imagine your starter question is like, say your name or wherever you're from, but what's the question when you're really trying to get the ball rolling, you're really getting into it?
I mean, I ask them, just simply, what are the benefits of being white? What are the drawbacks of being white? I ask them to describe an experience they had where they became aware of their race. I ask them if, based on our history, if they think that we owe black people anything. I ask them if Barack Obama is black or white. I have a sort of a...
Has anyone said white?
They say he chose to be black, or they say...
Come on.
No, absolutely. I think that people, I think that this idea of that, I sort of got on this road of what makes him black. He has a black father and a white mother, raised by a white family, went to all white schools, went to all, white institutions. He lives in the White House, so what makes him black? And I think it's a rhetorical question, right? I believe that your identity lies in the seam of how you perceive yourself and how the world how the world processes you and perceives you. And I don't think he doesn't have a choice. That the world perceives him as black. He experiences the world as a black American. And I would argue that how I experience the world as a white American is so fundamentally differently as if we're living in two different realities.
I think we have time for one more question.
How's it going, Whitney?
How you doing?
Being a colored actor, I'm constantly facing obstacles regarding roles and how certain roles go to only white actors. Do you think that Hollywood will ever surpass the racial divide? And if so, do you think there are any concrete steps that we should be taking?
I mean, I think that, honestly, I think that that the racial divide in Hollywood is going to be crossed when this country crosses the racial divide. I think that, there's this idea that, like most institutions, and Hollywood as a money-making institution is driven by money. And as long as that they feel that that's the way they're going to make money, I think it's very, very hard there's going to be a change to that. I mean, I'm not a narrative filmmaker, and I don't understand that world that much. But I think it's less nefarious than it is depressing. You know what I'm saying? It's not like some sort of grand plan. It's just kind of craven the way it is. But I think it's just a reflection. Hollywood is a reflection of the wider society, and the stuff that we consume is a reflection of the wider society. But I do think that's ultimately going to change when the demographics of this country changes, and that's coming down the pike.
Whitney, how can people catch up with the Whiteness Project? Just the website?
Well, you can go to our Facebook page at the Whiteness Project. I think it's called Let's Talk Whiteness Project now. And it's also the whitenessproject.org or whitenessproject.com. And you can see the whole set of videos of the millennials. And you can also see the videos the last installment that I did in Buffalo, and that whole set of videos that are done in Buffalo. So I think there's about 50 videos on the website that you can see. And they're all short, and they're all put in the context of data. And you can also, then the other thing that I like to do is, on it, there's also a source page. You can go and see the sources of the data. It's not just made up. You can go and dig down into the studies that I pulled the data from.
Whitney, thank you so much for being here. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Congratulations on the project.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.